Welcome to Tales from the Fandom, a podcast that brings a special guest out of the multiverse and straight to you. And now your host, David Ginsburg.
Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep, in caverns old, we must away, ere break of day, to claim our long forgotten gold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a special episode of Tales from the Fandom. We are celebrating the 80th anniversary of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. A special thanks to Jonathan Young for allowing us to use his cover of The Misty Mountains. Also thank you to Kevin MacLeod for the use of Ascending the Veil, the music that will be played between each of the segments coming up. The Hobbit was one of those formative fandoms for me. When I was younger, I remember watching the Rankin Bass cartoon version over and over again, not really knowing what I was watching, but remembering I liked it. I liked that this little guy, this hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, could affect change, even though he was often overlooked or sometimes forgotten about. He had the cool sword Sting that showed whenever orcs or goblins were near. He bested Gollum in a game of riddles, and he was the bearer of the One Ring. He even met a dragon, and his precious elves. He was this amazing character, and when I was gifted the box set of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy when I was in middle school, I dove right in. The Hobbit is an easy read for me now. I usually read it about once every year out of habit. It's a welcome introduction into the realm of Middle-earth, and I, for one, am fond of the Shire folk. I love hobbits. I feel that they're very close to how I am personally. I would love to live in the Shire and be a hobbit. It's hard to imagine book series of today standing the test of time as Tolkien's The Hobbit has done. Will the literary characters of this generation stand the test of time as Mr. Baggins of Bag End has done? I'm not sure. What I do know is this. If I live long enough to celebrate my 111st birthday, I know that people will still be reading about his adventures with Thorin, Gandalf, and the company of dwarves to retake the Lonely Mountain. They'll be immersed in the same world that I myself got drawn into, and that shaped me to who I am today. For this episode, I put out the call to find my own company of 14. 14 contributions to celebrate this 80th anniversary, and thus following are their oral stories, if you will, from across the world about J.R.R. Tolkien and The Hobbit. Please be sure to check out the show notes for links to their websites, podcasts, Facebook pages, and more. I thank them for their contribution because without them, this podcast would not be possible. The first of the company is Joseph Sale. Joseph is a novelist and creator of the 13 Dark Project, as well as an associate editor at Storgy Magazine. The others will introduce themselves as the show continues. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Tales from the Fandom.
I think one of the reasons I love The Hobbit so much is that it's actually a retelling of Beowulf, but one that is so fresh and original and fun that you don't even kind of notice it's happening. I think The Hobbit is quite a magical book in that respect, in that it's doing so many interesting things in terms of its story and its characters, but it remains so readable by both children and adults alike. And I think that's something really special when you've got a book that can transcend so many ages, so many cultures, and still be enjoyed on so many levels. So I think that has got to be one of the big reasons that I love The Hobbit. It's enchanting, it's magical, but it's also pretty deep.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim from the Forgotten News Podcast. And on this 80th anniversary of The Hobbit, I am going to share a thought about J.R.R. Tolkien, who is one of my favorite authors. Well, actually, what I'm really going to do is share a quote from another fan of Tolkien, a man named Peter Kreeft, a professor at Boston College and the author of an excellent book on the philosophy of Tolkien. Here's the quote, which sums up his overall outlook on Tolkien, and also mine, too. Those who love Tolkien are almost always good people, honest people. Some are Hobbit-like, and some are elvish, but none are orcish. Not all Tolkien haters are orcs, but all orcs are Tolkien haters. And, having said that, I sure hope there are no orcs among the listeners.
Hello, I'm Anthony von Dessauer from The Curse of Silverlake. In the early 1900s, a young British lieutenant valiantly fought in the trenches of the Great War. They called it the Great War because it was the pinnacle of man's inhumanity to man. It was the first war to involve mechanized weapons and chemical warfare. And there were days where tens of thousands of young men lost their lives in what can only be described as indescribable horror. But that young British lieutenant wasn't one of them. After serving valiantly in some of the bloodiest conflicts in the war, this young man was bitten by an insect, probably a flea. The conditions in the trench were horrible. It was squalor. That flea bite led to some sort of infection or disease, and he was inflicted with a high fever that ended up sending him home. That young lieutenant's name was J.R.R. Tolkien, who eventually went on to write The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. Now consider Tolkien's voice in The Hobbit and the character Bilbo, a character who would have preferred to stay home as opposed to going on an adventure with 13 strangers to retake a mountain of gold that had nothing to do with him. Contrast that with Tolkien himself, who was sent from fair England to mainland Europe to fight in a war that was all about treaties, again, that had nothing to do with him. Towards the end of The Hobbit, Bilbo finds himself in the midst of a great war between multiple armies. Prior to that war, he told his comrades that it was foolishness, that there was plenty of gold for everyone to share, and they mocked him. They called him a coward. They told him that he didn't know anything about the nature of war. And this is where Bilbo and Tolkien part ways. Bilbo was not a veteran, but he was the expressive voice of a man who both wanted to escape the atrocities of the real world and at the same time address those atrocities and make a case for peace. But not only did he make that case for peace, but he also took all his experiences of death and destruction and used them to plant a seed of creation. And that creation is a literary masterpiece, which is the foundation of so much of what we love today. Happy anniversary, Hobbit. And thank you, J.R.R. Tolkien.
Hi, this is Emily Prokop from The Story Behind at thestorybehindpodcast.com. My first experience with The Hobbit was in 8th grade when I was gifted a box set of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I remember staying home from school because I had a cold, and since there was nothing on TV at the time for kids my age to really watch, aside from The Price is Right, I decided to open the set and read The Hobbit. I knew my dad had read the books, and he loved them. Reading it while having a cold was actually a pretty cool way to enjoy the book, since I would fall asleep randomly and ended up having fever dreams about the story. I actually didn't remember for a long time what actually happened in the book versus what happened in those dreams until I reread it a few years later. I've read the book probably 3 or 4 times, and each time I would finish, I would try to pick up The Fellowship of the Rings, but never ended up getting into it. I liked Bilbo, and didn't really like Frodo as much for some reason. I didn't even see the movies when they came out, or even The Hobbit. I don't think any director could come close to what my fever-ridden brain came up with when I originally read the book.
My name is Gnome, and I'm the host of the Hexes and Bows podcast. And Dave asked me to kind of just briefly go over how important The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien is. And without a doubt, that is definitely the book that kind of, I guess I would say, changed my life. Because I don't really remember much of my childhood, for, whatever reason. Not like it was a bad childhood or anything. I just really have a terrible memory. But I remember the moment that book touched my hand, and that was in the 4th grade when I had asked the librarian, whose name, of course, I don't remember, but I wanted something more to read. I loved reading in school. I kind of read when I wasn't supposed to be reading, or I would read during class instead of paying attention, and I kind of read through everything. I needed something more. I needed something more engaging and challenging, and so she took me over to the fantasy section and handed me this book, and it was The Hobbit. And I'd never heard of it before. I didn't know who Tolkien was, and I really hadn't read much into the fantasy genre, because at that time that was like oh my goodness, how old was I back then? I don't know, 1995? Because I'd be, 6, 7? Sometime around then, because it was 4th grade, so like maybe 97 or so. But yeah, so here I am, this kid that, loved books like, the Animorphs and Redwall, things like that. And so I really enjoyed some fantasy stuff. But when I started reading through The Hobbit, I was taken away. Bilbo and, this whole colorful assortment of dwarves, dragons and magic and mystery, and I mean, you can kind of add a little bit of mayhem in there too. But Tolkien's writing, his ability to just completely drag someone into each individual page. I mean, it was so detailed, and as an adult now, it's a bit flowery, but I loved it. I wanted every single word, and I remember it was a tough book, to kind of get through, but I wanted that challenge, and I remember that instead of like recess, I would just be spending my time in the library, because they had this like kind of dimly lit little like nook area, and it was just really quiet and comforting. And I would kind of sit on the floor, propped up on these like, carpeted steps, and I would just stay there. I would get lost in the Misty Mountains, and that's something that will forever be a part of me, and really just led the way and led to my addiction and absolute love of everything in the fantasy genre. And I have to say, Hobbits, at the time, I mean, I was actually one of the taller kids of my grade, but I reached like maximum height at that time. And then, the next year, everybody else was taller than me, and I never grew again. So, knowing about hobbits and just kind of like their nature and not being nearly as adventurous, but, seeing somebody like Bilbo, and then, other hobbits in the Lord of the Rings, you just kind of could feel that connection, and that it was okay to be adventurous, and it was okay to step out of bounds and to challenge yourself and to try different things, and, to meet different people, to surround yourself with different people. And it was beautiful. And looking back as an adult, I can absolutely say that without, Tolkien's writings, without having had The Hobbit placed in my hands, I would 100% not be the person that I am today.
Hey guys, this is Jeff from Shattered Worlds RPG and Everything is Awesome with Jeff and KC. I first read The Hobbit, I want to say I was like 7 or 8, maybe 9. It was definitely in the library at my elementary school, and I just came across it one day. I don't think anybody ever just handed it to me. I saw a little guy with a sword on the cover, and I was interested. I think the scene that stuck with me the most was the 3 trolls, and somehow the Hobbit, just through a little trickery, was able to make them argue until the sun came out. Sorry, spoilers, but it was just really cool. And then when the movie came out, and I got to see Gollum for the first time, and Bilbo uses his brain again to trick Gollum, I thought, man, this is really interesting, the way you can trick somebody into not killing you. I just thought that was a really cool idea. The Hobbit influenced me by showing me that a book can be really well written and also be about this fantasy stuff, like elves and whatnot. And that was cool, I'm a little guy, I got bullied a bit, so the idea that this silly little guy that loves to stay at home somehow ends up in the midst of great history like that really spoke to me. Over the years, I wrote all kinds of fantasy stories. I wanted to make video games and all that jazz. I played role-playing games forever, Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. And when I got married, I kind of put that stuff to the side, and I really just wrote for fun, kind of, when I wasn't doing other stuff. And recently, because of the success of the podcast, Nerd Poker, and the Adventure Zone, I was like, you know what? I could start playing again and get a podcast. And so that's what we do over at Shattered Worlds. And man, anytime a little guy does something cool or gets away with a little trick, I just think of Bilbo Baggins, It's a whole lot of fun. And yeah, I think of myself as a writer who wants to focus on really important, interesting, thoughtful themes, and all that goes back to The Hobbit.
Hey there, I'm Russ Moore, co-host and dungeon master of Dumbgeons and Dragons, a D&D 5th edition actual play podcast. I'm super excited to be able to talk about The Hobbit on its 80th anniversary. Can you even believe that? In my eyes, good fiction is that which holds up to the test of time. The first time I read it, it was in elementary school, I think grade 5 or 6. I don't think I would have ever believed it was nearly as old as it was when I first read it. I shouldn't say old, more timeless though, because it is just that. It is a timeless piece of literature that shows no sign, to me at least, of the time period in which it was actually written. I was introduced to The Hobbit by one of my close friends, Spencer, who also taught me to play various RPGs. And it is the first book that I can remember reading that truly got me into the world of fantasy fiction, and to this day shapes the way I personally like to tell stories. So much so that I, along with my friends, have created our own story within the Tolkien-esque world of Forgotten Realms. To me, The Hobbit was one of the easiest, most enjoyable reads I've ever had, and still to this day probably have ever had. I mean, It's the story of a hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, not an adventurer, not a Herculean fighter or warrior or queen or king, a run-of-the-mill hobbit who is tasked with carrying out this extraordinary journey that he would have never in a million years thought of doing himself. And on this journey, Bilbo meets all types of people to help him along the way. Gandalf the wizard, the schemer who sets things into motion. The band of dwarven adventurers to help him from A to B and become something more along the way. He meets humans and orcs and gnolls and dragons. And it's in this style of storytelling that the seemingly mundane or ordinary individuals can do the most extraordinary and wild things imaginable. It's the call to action, the need to rise up for the greater good that can instill in many a feeling that the duty or the actions of a single person can truly make a difference in the world. So, happy 80th anniversary, and to 80 more years of adventuring to and with The Hobbit.
Hello, this is Zenger from the Zeng This Podcast. I just wanted to take a moment to, one, thank David for allowing me to be on for his Hobbit special, and two, to be able to talk about, of course, the book, The Hobbit, or There and Back Again. It is definitely an amazing book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I believe that, this in tandem with the Lord of the Rings has definitely influenced the world of fantasy for a long time, and I truly do not believe the world of fantasy would be what it is today without the amazing influence that J.R.R. Tolkien's books, which started with The Hobbit, have done. From the world of magic to Harry Potter to tons of other nameless amounts of fantasy. Like I said, this book is where it all began. And I cannot say how much I enjoy reading it. I think the characters in it are amazing, and it built this amazing world that he was able to capitalize on. And of course, his much more grandiose works with The Lord of the Rings and all that. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. The movie, well, you have to tune into my podcast. We'll cover it at some point. Once again, that is the Zeng This Podcast, and that's spelled Zeng this. Once again, thanks, David, for allowing us to have a quick moment to talk about our love of these books.
Hey guys, Foxman from the Boob Two Buddies here. Thanks to David and Tales from the Fandom for having me on to talk about The Hobbit. So, just want to quick go into what The Hobbit means to me. So, when I was about 8 years old, my older brother, who was about 10 years older than me, he gave me copies of a couple of different fantasy series. So, I had by David Eddings, I had The Belgariad and The Malorian, which is 10 books between the two of them. I had the Shannara series, which unfortunately got made into a TV series by MTV about a year or two ago and was awful. But then I also got The Hobbit and later Lord of the Rings. And in about a year, I devoured all of those books. And it left an indelible impression on me. It really became a big defining factor for my appetites. I got to a point where after that I was wanting to play nothing but Final Fantasy and Secret of Mana and Chrono Trigger for video games, and then eventually came the movies, and that's really where The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings as well became special for me, because this was a niche thing that me and a few friends of mine could get into, but after Lord of the Rings came along and after the Hobbit movies eventually, this really became a mainstream thing. So instead of enjoying all these fantasy aspects of entertainment in the closet, essentially, now all of a sudden, first off, we're getting the biggest and most expensive effects put into them to have these gorgeous tales put into incredible visuals, but also it became a thing that you could really discuss out in the open with anybody. I could be at a family gathering talking Hobbit with my uncle or somebody who before we'd have talked about the weather. Now all of a sudden there's this thing that I am super into that is a popular aspect of modern pop culture. And I think that that's important. I know a lot of people like to keep their interests sequestered off to keep them exclusive to them, but there is something powerful about having this shared experience, and I think that that's really what The Hobbit brought, at least for me personally. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much again to David and Tales from the Fandom for having me on. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of the episode.
Hello, my name is Christopher DeVoss. I'm one of the hosts of Podcast 42, and I'm the online producer of the Over the Line show. For me, The Hobbit will always be the 1977 animated movie, The Hobbit. Come to find out, the movie was made by Rankin and Bass, who also did all those great stop-motion movies like Rudolph and Baby New Year. In the movie, Bilbo kind of looks like a redheaded Ricky Gervais, and Gollum kind of looked like a cross between a possum and a frog, so that's really cool. I'll always remember the best scene for me in the movie was when Smaug, with his flashlight eyes, first confronted Bilbo. I will give Peter Jackson the win on Best Looking Gollum. Side note, I always thought Paul Coker, the guy who was behind a lot of the Mad Magazine stuff, did the animation for The Hobbit, but I guess he didn't. He did just about everything else for them, Rankin and Bass company, but not that movie. That's just my bad memory. On a closing note, if you really want to treat yourself to a Hobbit classic, you have to go to YouTube and search for Leonard Nimoy, Spock from Star Trek, singing the Ballad of Bilbo Baggins.
My name is Shelly from Stiffler Stitching, and I remember when I was really, really little, but I don't even remember how old I was, probably about 4 or 5. My dad was reading, he would read books to us every night, and one of the books he read to us was The Hobbit. And I grew up with that story in my head. I loved The Hobbit. I loved the riddles. Gollum scared me to death, especially when my dad did the Gollum voices, just scare me. And I remember growing up with the old animated movie, which I still adore the songs of the animated movie. So I was really excited when they made the Hobbit film. The Lord of the Rings, I was never overly attached to because my dad never read me that one. I never grew up with it. I tried to make it through all 3 books, and I made it through the first 2. But Tolkien tends to be a little long-winded for my taste. I love the storyline. I just don't need to know what every blade of grass looks like in that world. So I still have yet to make it through the 3rd book, which is terrible. But I love the story. I love the universe. And one of my favorite characters from Lord of the Rings was always Peregrine Took. For some reason, I just love him, and so therefore my son is named Peregrine, and we call him Pippin. So I really enjoy the Lord of the Rings universe, and especially The Hobbit. And I have grown up with it forever.
Hey guys, I'm Sebastian.
I'm Alex.
I'm Zane C. Weber.
And we're the hosts of the Second Take podcast, normally a film review podcast, but today we're talking to you about The Hobbit.
Yeah, The Hobbit.
So
Little people.
Yeah, so firstly, happy anniversary, I guess.
Happy Hobbit-versary.
Have you guys actually read The Hobbit?
Twice.
You actually have?
And I've listened to the audiobook multiple times.
And Zane, you?
I read it at least once a year.
Really?
No.
Oh, good.
I
Okay.
probably have read it cumulatively that many times.
Well, I'm just in the film boat here. The boat of I've saw the films, and well, why don't we talk about the book? Because I have a feeling that'll be a happier discussion.
It is a much better story than the film was because it didn't have a whole bunch of outside of the story things added into it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, for me, it was a nice, like, it's a elongated children's story, yeah?
Yep.
Probably, like, young adult sort of target audience, but the films did not, I think, uphold that side. I think it was a little darker and a little more like love triangle than.
It's much easier. It's much easier to kind of like buy into Bilbo in the book than it is in the movies, because the movies make such a big thing about the dwarves and then also the elves and then also Gandalf.
Yeah.
Whereas the book is really just a hero's tale following Bilbo through adventures that halflings never go on and then comes back rich.
And I think the films, that was taken away because we had already seen The Lord of the Rings, where the fucking hobbits are everything.
The one thing I'll just jump in with is I also like that there's such a clear cut between good and bad in these stories. Like, don't get me wrong, I like when the villains are a little bit more interesting, you get into it, but I also appreciate just blatant archetypes of, this is a bad guy, let's give him a black suit of armor.
Yeah.
And it is definitely pegged towards children in that regard, because they don't want you second guessing anything. Like, this is the bad guy, here he goes. Well, before we go, quick recap, guys. Favorite character from The Hobbit?
Smaug.
Smaug, really?
I love Smaug.
Is he as snarky in the book as he was in the movie?
Yes.
Ooh.
Gandalf.
Yep. I was going to say Gandalf too.
Because wizard.
Because wizard, exactly, that beard.
Or
Wizards are
any
overrated.
of the dwarves but Thorin.
No, Thorin was the grumpy one, wasn't he?
Yes.
I like the extra chubby dwarf. I forget his name though.
Bomber?
Yeah, that sounds about right. That sounds like a name.
That
I'd give it.
sounds like a fat name.
Yeah.
It does. Well, guys, thank you very much for having us, and big thanks to Tales from the Fandom. So,
Yeah.
thanks, guys.
Thanks for
Thanks,
listening.
guys. We love The Hobbit.
Hello, my name is Brett David Stewart. I'm the host of Silver Screens and Politics over on the Tilting Windmill Studios network. In my contribution to this wonderful celebration of the 80th anniversary of The Hobbit, I'd like to put in my 2 cents for the films Peter Jackson released between 2012 and 2014. They're actually good, and hear me out. I know fans and critics alike have a tendency to despise the films, but you need to take them for what they are, which is good-hearted fun. Now, should it have been 3 films worth of content? No, probably not. Should Peter Jackson have been as creatively liberal as he was with the subject matter? Maybe not. But without that, we wouldn't have Legolas defying gravity in numerous absurd situations, or Radagast, the Doctor, being pulled by giant rabbits like he's running the Iditarod. The movies are over the top, yes, but they use that to fuel a much larger narrative than we've previously seen in adaptations of The Hobbit. The performances are fantastic, it's nostalgic to see your favorite actors back in their Lord of the Rings roles, and it lets us live in the world of Middle-earth once more. At the end of the day, that's why I'm happy there are 3 films of it, even if the second one lags a bit, and I will concede that. More time in Middle-earth, the better. And Jackson had fun with it. It's time we stopped taking it so seriously and enjoyed the ride with him. Thanks for the opportunity to play devil's advocate and help celebrate one of my favorite novels. Cheers.
Greetings, this is Jim Ryan. You may know me from Jim Yes That Jim, or the CypherCast, or any number of other things. You'll have to forgive me, as I record this, I'm a little bit under the weather. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Those are the first words I have any memory of someone reading to me, and it fundamentally affected my life. The person reading was my mother, and the book was, of course, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I was very young, less than 5, I don't know exactly how old I was. My mother was an actress, she appeared mostly on stage, and she read wonderfully, and did the most entertaining voices for all of the characters. She did Bilbo and Gandalf wonderfully, she was the world's most horrifying troll, and she was the best ever Gollum. Her reading that book to me opened up the genre of fantasy, the genre of anything written, really. It engendered a love of reading, and a tradition that we continued for a very long time. After The Hobbit, we moved on to other books. At some point, we got to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and then we would read lots of fantasy and science fiction, and eventually we'd take turns. She would read to me, and I would read to her. It helped get me into reading, it helped get me into acting, it helped get me into role-playing. Without The Hobbit, there is no me. And it gave me some of the most treasured memories of my mother that I will ever have. That book was so important to us that in the mid-90s, when she was ill from cancer, I picked that book as the one that I would read to her when I was visiting her. It was sort of completing a cycle. Since that was the first thing that I could ever remember her reading to me, it would also be the last thing that I ever read to her. And in the end, that's how things played out. I still have that copy of the book, and I'll always have it as something to remember her by. It's something for which I'm eternally grateful. So I'm very happy to celebrate this anniversary of the book, and I am utterly pleased whenever I see any adaptation of it come out. For all their flaws, I liked the Hobbit movies that Peter Jackson did. Certainly they could have been better, and there's an episode of my own podcast where we have a roundtable discussion about that, and go into great detail, but still, I'm very grateful that they're there. For me, The Hobbit is a fundamental part of my identity, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep, in caverns old, we must away, ere break of day, to claim our long forgotten gold. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, it flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light. Far over the misty mountains gray, to dungeons deep, in caverns deep, we must away, ere break of day, to win our house in gold from
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fandom. Subscribe to us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. Follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/talesfromthefandom to see photos, links, leave feedback, and check out upcoming guests. If you'd like to be a guest, email David at talesfromthefandom@gmail.com.